Hello everybody, welcome to number 27, I'm Jack, and this is a truly exceptional car. When it first came out in 1969, this 411 was the fastest true four-seater in production. It was probably also the best GT in the world. It is considered peak Bristol, and demand for it was such that they made another series of this well after its replacement had come out. It represents a change of era at Bristol because it introduced what was perhaps the most eccentric boss that the motor industry has ever seen. So George White was running the company at the time, and he was part of the original family who started the Bristol aircraft manufacturer. But about a month before this was launched, he had quite a bad car crash, which meant that he ended up having to sell to Anthony Crook. It's worth taking a few seconds out to talk about him and to take a closer look at the 411. At this point in time, Crook was one of Bristol's biggest dealers, but he had previously been a really successful racing driver, and he hated motoring journalists with a passion. Andrew Frankel met him twice. He said the first time he was incredibly rude about him, and the second time spectacularly rude about somebody else. To say that he was eccentric doesn't really do him justice. There are so many stories about him. Apparently at one motor show he dressed up as an Arab sheik, went to the Rolls Royce stand and put in loads of fake orders. And he is famous for refusing to sell his cars to people that he didn't like. It is said that when he saw Michael Winner peeking into the Kensington showroom, he quickly ran up to the door and changed the sign from open to closed. As usual with Bristol, the naming is a little bit confusing, with there being no less than 6 variants of the 411. The 1 and 2 were probably the prettiest with their single headlight front end. But this Series 3, with its revamped looks and twin headlight setup, is still a striking car without being overly flashy, and it's said that its 4 headlight setup was the most powerful of its time. Certainly I think that this was the last handsome Bristol that was made. The 603 and the 412 that followed it could be described as idiosyncratic at best. At this time, Rolls Royce had moved to monocoque construction, leading one journalist to say that they were little more than Cortinas with a little bit of leather and wood. Not so with the Bristol, who continued to have a separate body chassis construction with hand-beaten aluminium panels. Inside you find the same levels of craftsmanship that you get in Elvis and Rolls Royce Bentleys of this time. Incredibly supple, thick leather. This car has also been retrimmed by Bristol, so the seats are in fantastic condition, but they do have some real idiosyncrasies. Again, fantastic quality wood, but first of all, to get into the back of the car, move the seats forward, they don't clip into place, so they just move forward, which is quite odd. I'm not sure if it's the best thing in terms of safety, but also that belt clip moves back and forth as well, so that you have room to get into the back. The leather braided handle here is quite unusual, and the ergonomics are interesting to say the least. It is a very comfortable car, the driving position is good, but the switches here, even in daylight, they're quite hard to read. It even has, oddly, a fuel reservoir switch, even though there is a reserve light on the panel. Then, fitting for the time perhaps, there are no fewer than 5 ashtrays in this. So, one at the top there, which is nice and handy for the driver, but in case that's not enough, one in the passenger door, one in the driver's door, and 2 at the back of the car as well. You have a heel pad down here. That is really nice, thick leather. There's also a key here, which is quite interesting, just nestled by your accelerator foot. And that is to open up the side panels, which we'll take a look at now. On the passenger side, that's where they housed the spare wheel. Here you have the battery, the brake servos, some of the electrical stuff. And it's worth noting that the battery being here and so low is obviously advantageous to the handling. There's something else which is highly unusual. You can see 4 pretty standard looking exhausts, but there's a trick to them. It looks like they exit here. They actually don't. There are some holes at the bottom. What are they there for? Can you switch her on? So essentially, being a big American V8 6.3 litres, on startup it tends to be a little bit rich and smoky. So to stop you getting your trousers dirty, or if you're in your garage, the wall, or someone going by, they exit at the bottom. Crook almost never allowed journalists to drive his cars, so I'm pretty sure he'd be appalled to have a lowly YouTuber in it today. Luckily, Simon, who owns this one, was happy for me to have a go. Now, despite it being quite a narrow car, inside we have plenty of room, so much so that it really is a proper four-seater car, and as such, it was the fastest one of its day. 140 miles an hour from the 6.3 litre Chrysler V8, which was actually re-engineered by Bristol. So for example, rather than normal tappets, they had hydraulic ones. The reason for that is they thought the owners of Bristol should spend the least time possible back at the dealership getting them serviced. Now, isn't that incredibly refreshing? I think in the modern day they do the opposite really. They try and bring you in as much as possible, spend as much money with them as they can. Not with Bristol. They wanted you to drive the car, not having sitting in a garage having money spent on it. When we talk about that top speed, you have to bear in mind that a Rolls Silver Shadow could only manage 118 miles an hour, and a Mercedes 300 CE 124. So really quite impressive for 1969. Now they're quite heavy cars, about 1,600 kilos, which at this point in time was pretty much a behemoth. I was expecting it to feel quite unwieldy on the corners, and in truth, initial lean is quite impressive, but it levels out pretty quickly, and it's a far more nimble car than those Rolls Royces. Let's see how that big Chrysler lump feels taken right through the gears. The 3 gears. It has a 3-speed, I think it's called a torque flight gearbox, which is smooth, but perhaps a little bit limited when it comes to performance. Well, you know, it does make progress in quite an impressive manner, and it has a really sporty, aggressive sound. When you put your foot down, the gearbox keeps the engine between sort of 3.5 and 5, and it does sound pretty angry. Normally driven, you know, at normal speeds, at sane speeds, it's quite cultured. There is a little background growl there, that American sound, American V8 sound, but when you put your foot down, it really does take on a very different character, and it is plenty fast enough. Its most immediate comparison is probably the Rolls Royce. Now, in terms of overall refinement, I'd say that this is slightly lower. So the ride is very good, but it has a tinge of firmness compared to the Rolls. So it doesn't quite flatten out the road in the same way. I mean, when you're in a Silver Shadow, it almost feels like it's unrolling a brand new sort of road in front of you. It makes it all feel so smooth. This isn't quite on that level, but it is so much better when it comes to the handling. The steering is light, yes, but it retains a pleasing amount of feel and weight compared to the Rolls and even the Mercedes. Both of those are very much numb in comparison. One thing I would say is, having driven an earlier generation of Bristol, for these, they went to recirculating ball steering. The previous cars were rack and pinion, and you can feel the difference. It's not the weighing or the feel, which is fine. It's just the lack of precision off center, which is something which is very much linked to this kind of new system. So on the whole, although it still suits the car, it's nice and light, a Rolls does never of this era, never encourages you to be, you know, to drive it hard. This feels like it enjoys it. Gear changes when you're going normally are pretty much imperceptible, and when you put your foot down, it will kick down pretty quickly for a Slushmatic. So on those counts, it's not too bad. I take it through these tighter bends again because I'm just keen to explore that chassis. The front is maybe a little reluctant to turn in at first, and then the back end pleasingly sort of moves out a little bit, and these have limited slip diffs as standard. All in all, for a big old beast of this time, it really does handle. I mean, yeah, it's no sports car, but pretty impressive. So how would I sum up the 411? You would say perhaps that it's like a more sporting Rolls Royce. I don't think that's too far off the mark, but I think in a way it's selling it short. Some of the interior switchgear perhaps is not quite as nice, and the detailing not quite as nice as a Rolls, but it performs and handles so much better. And despite the Rolls maybe clinching it very slightly in terms of overall refinement, I think that for an intercontinental dash, this would easily be the more relaxed car to drive, because it's so much more responsive, easier to thread through bends, that I think you'd be more relaxed at the end of it than if you were forced to crawl along in a Silver Shadow. All in all, I do love the Rolls as well. It's just a very different car. Now, before we finish, let me just take a second to say something really important. Simon, who was good enough to lend me his car today, is a volunteer blood biker. So these guys take blood from A to B, you know, from hospital to hospital, when it's needed, urgently, as quickly as possible. And they do it totally out of their own time. And the organisation is run without costing a penny to the NHS. They do it entirely through contributions. So do go and have a look at their website. If you can, give them a little something towards their costs. I will put their link in a pinned comment in the video. Thank you all so much for watching. Thank you to Simon for coming down today. See you all for the next video.